If you're a regular Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listener, please rate and review us on iTunes or using the podcast app on your phone. We currently have 976 5-star ratings, and it would be great to get that up to 1,000. And so I want to give a special thank you to Durf Diggler, who just gave us this 5-star review. Great for sci-fi discovery. This is my go-to podcast source for new and classic sci-fi. I've shared many episodes with my like-minded friends. Excellent, insightful panels and host. Keep up the great work. So big thanks again to Durf Diggler for that great review. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 477 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing William Gibson's classic 1984 novel Neuromancer. And this will involve spoilers for everything in the book, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Matthew Kressel, making his 19th appearance on the show. He's the author of the novel King of Shards, and his short story Now We Paint Worlds was just published on Tor.com. His second novel, Queen of Static, is available now on his Patreon page over at patreon.com/Matt Kressel. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. It's good to be back.
The next up, we've got Teresa Delucci, making her 12th appearance on the show. Her articles have appeared on Boing Boing and Den of Geek, and her short fiction has appeared in or is forthcoming in Strange Horizons, Weird Horror, Lightspeed, and Tor.com, where she also reviews books, TV, and video games. So Teresa, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me again. You can't see it, but pretend I have a razor blade manicure just for the occasion.
Nice.
And also joining us today is Sam J. Miller, making his 9th appearance on the show. He's the Nebula award-winning author of the novels Blackfish City, The Art of Starving, and Destroy All Monsters. And his short fiction appears in magazines such as Lightspeed, Nightmare, and Strange Horizons. His new novel, The Blade Between, is currently number 2 on the horror bestseller list. So Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me behind surgically implanted mirrored glasses.
Man, you guys have all the cool prosthetics.
Okay, so let's start off with Matt and have you tell us about your history reading Neuromancer.
Yeah, I was thinking about this because I knew you were going to ask me this. I believe that my first encounter with Neuromancer was at a bookstore in Florida. We used to go visit my grandfather in Fort Lauderdale, and usually the first or second day when we got there, my father would take me to the bookstore and say, I want you to buy at least 3 books, more if you want. I usually get 5 or so. And I remember that I picked up Neuromancer, probably because I thought it sounded cool. I hadn't read it. This was pre-internet days, so the only way I really heard about stuff was, I go to the bookstore and pick something up, or maybe someone told me about it. I don't think I knew about Neuromancer. And it was. I remember being really, really excited about the computer aspect of it. I was a huge Tron fan. And so the idea of entering into a virtual computer world was super exciting to me. And I remember also being really fascinated with the drug aspect of it, even though I think this was 1987 when I encountered it. So maybe 88, probably 87. And no, I had not done any drugs at that point. But I remember oh, this book has drugs and computers in it. It's it was really hitting my buttons at the time.
And so did you read it just that one time, or did you read it a bunch of times?
I read it that one time, and then as I got older and more into writing fiction and things like that, I started to read all the other Gibson stuff. I went back and read Burning Chrome and Count Zero, Mona Lisa Overdrive, all that stuff. I think I've read almost everything that Gibson's written. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in his stuff, but no, I did play the video game, the C64 game, which was the coolest thing at the time. That a book that I thought everything I encountered in the bookstore was completely obscure, probably because a lot of my friends weren't big science fiction readers. So I was really the only one who was encountering this stuff. So then when there was a game that came out that referenced this book I had read, I was it blew my mind. I'm like, oh my God, a Neuromancer game. That's amazing. The game wasn't that great, but
All right, cool. And how about Teresa? What's your history with Neuromancer?
Well, I dated a guy in the 90s who met at an industrial club, and he was a self-styled computer hacker himself. So he lent me his copy of Neuromancer, and I kept the book, and I lost a boyfriend and went on to really read and love pretty much everything from William Gibson ever since. I was never a huge science fiction reader, but I loved the prose. It just pulled me in, especially in the short stories. I might have read Burning Chrome and those stories before I even read Neuromancer, so I kind of read him in publication order. And I think that just added a lot to the book itself. I wouldn't say Neuromancer is my favorite of his. It's a great one. It's iconic, but I'm definitely a big stan for the Bridge trilogy instead. Virtual Light, Adoru, All Tomorrow's Parties. Those are my favorites personally. But yeah, it was good to revisit this one.
And then how about Sam? What's your history with Neuromancer?
So with very on-brand ineptitude, I read Count Zero before I read Neuromancer, and that's the sequel, so that's dumb. And I loved it, and I just love the world I'm in when I'm reading William Gibson. It's so interesting that so much of his fiction is about entering the virtual, and that's the experience of reading him, is he sucks you in and makes the virtual feel real in the same way that it is for Case in Neuromancer. So yeah, like Teresa said, the prose is just so perfect and sharp and amazing. And so I read Neuromancer not long after, and I've read it several times since then. There's some science fiction writers who I adore who don't make me envious. Like Ted Chiang is my favorite. I'm never going to be Ted Chiang. I love Octavia Butler. I'm never going to be Octavia Butler. I never feel envy or anger or insufficiency when I'm reading them. But William Gibson makes me feel like jealous. Like that's so close to what I want to do, and I could never get there. But I just love the experience of reading him. And Neuromancer is such a brilliant sort of like, I don't know. It's science fiction, but it's so many things. It's like the greatest noir story ever. The sort of way that it hits the noir story plot points is so perfect. I'm not sure that it's my favorite. I think that while I love the Bridge trilogy, I think Pattern Recognition is my favorite. And we can talk more about sort of like the arc of William Gibson's career, of like the things he wasn't good at that he got good at, and the things that he was good at that he is no longer good at. But yeah, my relationship with Neuromancer is tempestuous and intense and troubled and exhilarating.
Well, you notice, Sam, that he was 35 when he wrote this book?
That's super interesting. That makes me feel a little better. It's not like a Citizen Kane where it's like, oh, this dude was 25 when he made the greatest movie ever. F him.
Well, that is a lot younger than I am now, so makes me very, very angry.
I just recently reread right before the panel, actually, I believe it's his first published short story, Fragments of a Hologram Rose.
Yes.
And it's just so perfect. And it's like, this was his first story. Like, what was he doing before this? I mean,
that's that guy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think he's brilliant. Yeah. I mean, we had him on the Fantastic Fiction at KGB series a couple months back, and even just chatting with him, it's just there's such a mind there. It's such a brilliant person.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what was he doing before? I mean, it seems like from what I read of his biography, I mean, well, it seems like he spent a lot of his childhood just kind of like locked in his room reading science fiction, and then spent his kind of early young adulthood traveling around randomly to countries where it would be cheap to live and doing lots of drugs.
And also not getting drafted.
Yeah.
I think that was a big part of his early life as well. And I think why he ended up in Canada ultimately.
Yeah. So it's Yeah. It is interesting that he like came out of the box so fast with these with this really polished prose and all this knowledge about all these esoteric subjects. And yeah, obviously he was just really, really gifted. I have kind of an interesting, this is the first time I've read Neuromancer. Sort of when I was growing up, my parents are both scientists, and they're very into like golden age, sort of humanistic, techno-optimistic science fiction. And so, they weren't really that into the new wave, and they weren't really that into cyberpunk. And so, they had read Neuromancer and were kind of like, you can skip this one. Mm-hmm. And I did read, I read at least the first couple stories in Burning Chrome. And, I remember liking them okay, but, especially when I was a teenager, I really had an issue with, like stories where there was lots of made up slang and made up, jargon and techno babble and stuff. I found a lot of the things really, really hard to understand what was going on. And I found that really frustrating. I guess Matt was sort of saying that he didn't really understand.
I mean, yeah, so I think one of the strengths of Neuromancer, and also possibly its weakness, is that it's so dense and cryptic and filled with this, as you said, jargon, that sometimes you don't know what's going on. And I think that it works in the sense of it pulls you in. It's an immersion technique. But at the same time, there's a feeling of disconnectedness with what's happening. So it's like, and I think that's intentional on Gibson's part. I think he wants us to feel kind of overstimulated. And, so there are times where I'm like, I'm totally with him. I'm not sure I know exactly what's happening, but I know he's going to take me in for a soft landing, And I think, when I first read Neuromancer, everything I had read before that was like golden and silver age SF, Arthur C. Clarke, Larry Niven, Asimov's, all that stuff. And then so when I encountered Neuromancer, I'm like, what is this? This is like completely different. And I think, Gibson talked a little bit about wanting to, he had, like you said, David, that he kind of reacted against that techno-utopianism with his work.
Yeah, although I have to say, like, at this point, having read 1,000 science fiction novels, I didn't find this to be that hard to follow, except for a couple of things maybe we'll get to. But, getting into it, I was like, and I wasn't sure I was going to like it, sort of as I said, but I was really blown away by the first 6 chapters. I just absolutely loved. I thought that they felt incredibly fresh, even given that this book is, about the internet, written 40 years ago, written in 1983 on a typewriter. It still feels fresh and exciting and vibrant and, bracing, reading it now.
It not only feels fresh and bracing, it feels like, I don't know, I still feel like there are story ideas that pop into my head, or when I'm developing a novel and trying to figure out what's going to happen, there are still things that I think of, and then I'm like, shit, can't do that. Neuromancer did it already. It's actually something that I experience a lot with William Gibson, of like, that's a great idea that I was going to use, or, I just think it's so, his ideas are so dense and exciting, that it still feels like something that if you were to rip off half the things in this book and use them in a book now, it would be amazing. Like, it wouldn't feel dated. It wouldn't feel weird.
Yeah. And they're good ideas. And there are also tons of, like every page, there's some like clever, there's some like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. I mean, it's just absolutely stuff, possibly overstuffed, and we can get into that with ideas, but yeah. But so I want to get back to Teresa too. So Teresa, kind of what was it like for you going back to the beginning of Neuromancer?
Going back, it was unusual because I've been reading just a lot of straight up horror lately, and just not in this genre at all. So it was a nice kind of break. I think it was definitely escapist. You are thrown headlong into this world of crime and flashing advertisements and space rastas and gothic resorts and clones, and it's just there's so much here. And in some ways revisiting it again, because it's been a very long time, I'm like, this does seem like a slightly younger man's kind of book in a certain way. I found at first where I was definitely, parts of it did feel a little dated to me, but I think that's because this book is so iconic and so many other properties in film and video game, other books have played off of it. That this, like, they take the window dressing from Neuromancer, but don't really get into the depth that he does. And then once I got more into the character and the function of the plot, I was just really pulled along and absorbed in it all over again. But I definitely agree that some parts of it, I'd totally forgotten and were big surprises, some of these twists. And other times I was a little confused by what's going on, because Gibson does just drop you in and doesn't really hold your hand as much. But I definitely appreciated the William S. Burroughs feel of it all, actually. And I think that was a big influence on him in his writing of this. So I kind of appreciated, maybe more than when I read it the first time, I was just confused by some of the narrative techniques he was using and the way he kind of structures a world and structures these reveals of information, which I think really are extremely clever and continue to play well.
Yeah, well, let's just set up the basic plot off the bat here. So our protagonist is Case, and he's a hacker. He breaks into corporations and banks and stuff and steals their data. And in this world, you do this by connecting like electrodes to your head, and so you're really inside the virtual world. And he had ripped off some money from one of his employers, and they had punished him by I don't know, doing something, poisoning him, I guess, mycotoxin, so that he can't jack into the internet anymore. And so with his main means of making a livelihood stripped from him, he's stuck doing sort of low-level crimes in Chiba City, which is, I think, in Japan, and is in big trouble and is wanted by all sorts of gangsters and stuff like that. And this woman named Molly comes to him, and she has sunglasses kind of surgically implanted in her head. And she says that she's working for this guy Armitage, and they want to hire Case for some mysterious mission. And that's sort of how the book starts out. I don't know, Sam, is there anything else we should set up about the basic setup here right off the bat here?
Oh, well, I mean, it's he's, in true noir fashion, he's been hired to do a dangerous job by an employer he doesn't fully understand, and who turns out to be, you said at the beginning we're going to be spoilery, right? Yes. This is like one of my favorite things about the book.
Go.
Is that this book is really like a love story between two AIs who are prevented from uniting because it would enrage the Turing police, which is this amazing concept that Gibson uses occasionally, of the idea that there would be attempts to limit the intelligence of AIs, and so these two artificial intelligences are manipulating humans to circumvent the safeguards that have been set up to prevent them from uniting and creating some new crazy, weird, game-changing thing. And then they're in outer space, and then there's Rastas, and then there's lots of murder and a clone ninja.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it that Wintermute wanted to merge, but Neuromancer did not, or is that not correct? Because I think Neuromancer.
That's correct.
Yeah, so it's like Neuromancer was like, no, I'm my own identity now. I don't want to merge, and then Wintermute's like, no, that's my reason of being, right? So
yeah, it's a toxic love story. It's a story of yeah.
And speaking of Teresa, speaking of things that like you forgot, I like that. I really loved, and I completely forgot this. That okay, so at the beginning, this is a spoiler. Obviously, we're spoiling. Case's girlfriend Linda Lee is murdered, right? So she's dead, and he's clearly wounded by this, seriously, and like to the point that like Neuromancer like fucks with him by showing Linda Lee, but then later on we see that they have like created a copy of Case's mind, and then you see Case's copy and Linda Lee's copy, like their digital copies, like living together with Neuromancer, and I was like, oh, that's really sweet, but kind of horrific at the same time. And I was like, you know, his copy, his digital copy, gets to be with the woman, but he decided not to stay there because he recognized that wasn't real. And I was like, that's really bittersweet and clever and something that I hadn't remembered at all.
Okay, so Matt, that's like the second to last paragraph of the entire book. So,
well, then it's definitely a spoiler. Yeah.
I mean, this is like, but let's try to go in a little more sequential order a little bit. But so I said that the first 6 chapters, absolutely loved it. Pretty much everything about them, wouldn't change a thing. How do people? But Teresa, you said that like the book sort of off the bat kind of struck you as sort of a young man's book or something. Like what?
Well, yeah, yes and no. In some way, I guess because and I'm saying this from, some different, positions, I guess, where it's like, well, the noir trope has so often been like a sad sack, younger, down on his luck man with a dead girlfriend, scraping by, we have met this kind of character many times before. I'm not saying that it's good or bad, just, it's a trope for a reason.
Okay, I'll definitely grant you that, is that I think that, a lot of the characters in the book I found either bland like Case or kind of one-dimensional. And so that was like, I did want more character development for sure.
And then, then I guess for me, one of the big drivers of the plot is, when Molly Millions shows up. I mean, instant like eyeball kick, like literally, like mirror eyes, and she's a killer. She's, razor girl, step-in razor. Like she has all of these amazing street names, and she looks like Chrissy Hind in like the 80s, but like punk, like even more punk, like really arresting character. And then, you're really liking her, and there is stuff to her background that again makes her like a tropey kind of noir gun moll. I mean, I think some people said that might be where her name comes from, and it's probably not her real name, but Molly Gun Moll. She has her own very sad past, and there are things where it's like the way she's described, and just how frequently she gets naked for Case, and the one thing that really made me like roll my eyes was like there's a scene where Case and Molly have to go to, I believe it's London, and get Dixie from his stored personality to help do this big basic heist.
Yeah, actually, let's just explain that. So there's Case had a mentor in his hacking days named McCoy Polly, who had and so in this world there's something called ICE, intrusion countermeasures electronics, which is how computer systems protect themselves from hackers. And then there's something called Black Ice, which is ice that's so badass it can actually kill the hacker as part of the defense. And so this McCoy Polly guy had been killed by Black Ice a couple times, I think, but had been kind of his heart had stopped, but he had been resuscitated. And so I'm actually a little unclear on at what point he got the nickname Dixie Flatline, but he got this nickname Dixie Flatline. and at the point in the story that we pick up, he's totally dead, but his like brain patterns are preserved on a ROM that's stored in this this computer it's like is it a media company or something, like SenseNet or something, but anyway, so that's what Teresa's talking about. There's this character who only exists as a computer simulation on this ROM that they have to go retrieve. Okay, so Teresa.
Yeah, and this is like really my favorite chapters, I think, where I love a good story of like getting the gang back together again, or like when you're meeting all of the Ocean's 11 characters and how they're going to meet, come together for this one big job. So yeah. But there was this scene where like I definitely like paused and like rolled my eyes, where Molly is using her body and Case is spying through her eyes to kind of get into this security place, whatever it is, like this media company. And so she knows that he's there in her head. So the first thing she does is like squeeze her own boobs. And I'm just like, really? Really? That does not, no. I'm like, no, this is not liking this part right here. Like, that's just ridiculous. But, like I keep getting torn on if I find Molly to be kind of a bit of a cliche character, or she is kind of cheeky. And I think she has more personality and style than pretty much anybody in the book.
She's also the only character of the major characters in this book to pop up again later. She's one of the main characters in Mona Lisa Overdrive, which I think speaks to the fact that like she's the one who's like actually interesting and dynamic, and that was worth revisiting, much more so than Case.
Yeah, and she was also the first character that he wrote for, because she was in Johnny Mnemonic. And that's the Johnny boyfriend that she lost, that she keeps talking about, which was another amazing story.
Yeah, and if people don't know, Johnny Mnemonic is a short story that that Gibson wrote before Neuromancer. Matt,
Gibson said, and talking about the last paragraph, I'm going to talk about the last line, if that's.
We haven't even talked about the first line. If we're really going in order, we have to talk about the iconic first line.
All right, but then I'm gonna forget my thought then. But no, all right. You want to do the first line and then we'll do the last line? That's fine.
The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. Never forgot that one.
I think that has to be the most iconic first line of any novel, any science fiction novel ever. Like, I can't think of another first line that really sticks in my head like that one.
Yeah, and I always imagine static, like white and gray and black shifting static. But I thought William Gibson actually said that he intended a sort of like silver gray kind of color in older TVs. I don't know if anyone knows more about that.
Well, now when I think of a dead channel now, when I had first read it, I pictured blue, like a bright blue. Yeah. Because that's how cable has changed. I didn't have, I wasn't thinking snowy gray static of when the book was written. I was thinking of when I was in the 90s and I read it, my dead channels were blue.
It's interesting that the colors of dead channels went from actual colors of the sky, right? From gray to blue. I think in one of the versions that I have, he talks about that in the introduction, about how that color changed. And, he was talking about that he couldn't even anticipate cell phones, but it's still powerful regardless.
Yeah, I read a recent interview with Gibson where he was talking about specifically how he writes the first couple of lines. I think it was a series for The Guardian, and this was around when his most recent novel, or second most recent novel, The Peripheral, came out. Mm-hmm. And he talked about, writing and rewriting the opening of all of his novels, but Neuromancer in particular. And I think what I like about that one that resonates is, is the sky gray or is it blue? Does it matter really? Because at the end of the day, you're thinking about a kind of technology that is obsolete. And here's like a blank slate. And now here is what we're living with. There is nothing dead. Like, here's what is alive in this world. And we're going to immediately throw you into it.
Yeah.
And it brilliantly situates you in a world mediated and shaped by technology.
Absolutely.
Like what is the sky? It's television.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also the idea that it's a dead channel. So it's like something that like you said, Teresa, was there, but it's already obsolete. And I think that we see this in a lot of cyberpunk after that, and contemporary with that, and this idea that you're in a future where technology is already obsolete, where stuff that we would consider advanced is already old. And I find that not just old, but decaying.
Yeah. Before we get, I do want to give you, Matt, a chance. You said you wanted to talk about the last line, so let's just do
All right,
that.
let me see if I remember it. Okay, so I think the point was, I think the last line was that he never sees Molly minions again, right?
Yeah.
And so Gibson said that the reason why he wrote that line is because he did not want to do a sequel, and then immediately was asked to do a sequel. So he couldn't put Case in it, or he could, but then he couldn't write about Molly. So I think that's why he's like, you know what, Molly. He probably said, yeah, Molly's a more interesting character. Let's put her in.
Yeah, and I also think he wrote about some of her experience already. Again, in Burning Chrome, the title story, Burning Chrome, has as its center a puppet parlor, which is a brothel, which is again like Molly. You know, it could be this cliche and this trope, and you know, there's something about like the portrayal of a sex worker, but it's very matter of fact, and it, you know, she feels like it was very much her choice to work at a puppet brothel and rent out her body and fragment her mind as best she could to pay for these implants to her eyes, her nails, her reflexes that will make her stronger and more employable, you know, so giving her that power. And, you know, so much of this novel is about fragmented personality and who has access to your inner life and these trails that you leave in your data when you're in a world like this where everything is connected. So it's like there's one thing of like, you know, capitalism run amok and pushing people to the margins and the hard choices they have to make and the ways they have to live with their decisions. But then it becomes this other philosophical question as well, like this other branch of who is Neuromancer and what is its goal, and who is Case and who is Dixie. You know, it's again like layers upon layers. It's just astounding that Gibson makes it all work out.
Well, let me ask you, because, you know, like I said, I just absolutely love the first 6 chapters, which is about the first 100 pages. And then the last 200 pages, I really found a bit of a slog. And I'm just curious if that's just me or do other people feel that way. So Sam, how do you feel about like the first half versus the second half of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole book is, to me, really exciting, really engaging. I think it moves fast and breaks things. And you know, there's no real point where I'm like, okay, this is dragging on. I mean, I think that to me, if I have a problem with Neuromancer, or a thing that I think he figured out later that he doesn't know how to do here, is make you really care about a character and identify with them. And I think Teresa said this really well already, of just like feeling their yearning and having them feel like real, vibrant, three-dimensional characters. And so even if I'm sort of like following characters who are in many ways pastiches, honestly, I feel like besides Molly, the only characters who feel really alive and hungry to me are the AIs. You know, I think that's something that he figures out in later books. But for me, as like plot, like this is like plot 101. Like this is how you do a plot. This is the lessons of like the great golden age of science fiction and the great Raymond Chandler noir moments that he grew up on. That like this is just like fast moving, beat after beat, and if there's some things that aren't quite great, you're sort of like pulled along so fast, you if you notice them, they don't really throw you out of it.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump off of that, I think that like you said, Sam, it's moving so fast you don't necessarily notice the deficits in character development, and I think that's why Pattern Recognition is my favorite Gibson novel, is because I think he just does such a great job of characterization in that we're with God, what's her name? Case the whole way.
Also Case.
Yes,
Also Case. It's spelled differently, yes. Case all the way through. And you know, just like it starts off in pattern recognition with her talking about like how she's squicked out by the Michelin man because he looks like a maggot, and then like it's like right there I'm like I'm totally with her. Like I to this day I can't look at that without thinking of that. But no, I think you don't really notice some of the deficits because it's moving so quickly. I think that like Dave, that I agree the first 6 chapters are brilliant. I didn't think that the rest of it lagged at all. I just think that some of the immediacy, maybe that's not the right what I'm thinking of. Like I think the first 6 chapters were building stuff, and then the rest of it's like stuff's just happening. And like one of the surprises for me coming back to this was I forgot how much of this took place in space. Like I remember when I read it the first time, I was like, oh, my memory of it was like, oh, they were only in space for like a chapter or two. And like, no, it was like it was a big chunk of this. And so that was surprising to me, and just kind of casually thrown in there. Like yeah, we have orbital cities where the rich go and hang out, and there's Rastafarians living up there, and they're flying on these shuttles between stations, and it reeks like weed, and it's like, oh yeah, like it was just stuff that I had forgotten that that kind of just carried me along because it was just so creative and inventive, and even to this day, like just reading it however many years it is later, and seeing it fresh, I think that was enough to propel me through.
Well, yeah. So let's just explain that. So there's this big space station called Freeside, which is basically like Las Vegas space station, and there's this family that owns it, and they have their own section of it. It's called the Villa Straylight, and the scion of this family, the main one that we see, I love this name, is 3 Jane Marie France Tessier Ashpool. So she's super rich. Like all this, all this stuff in the last 200 pages in terms of plot I liked. I just felt like it got kind of repetitive with the hacking and climbing up and down ladders and stuff like that. And, before we started recording, Teresa was saying that, usually she's on the podcast to talk about horror novels, and this isn't a horror novel. But I really felt like the last third of this basically is a horror novel. It really felt like The Shining to me or something. It's basically like they go into a haunted house, and they like stuff kind of starts seeming sort of dreamlike, and this stuff, these visions from their past get dredged up, and just the geography of the Villa Straylight seems really surreal, and it just seems like gigantic and kind of like MC Escher-esque to me.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And that's one of the things that I kind of forgot about the book too. Like they build up Villa Straylight as like a Gothic castle that's basically run by moneyed inbred clones. It's horrifying. And I have a whole side tangent about the rich up in space this week. I mean, we all know the news week, and that's one of the things that's just so timely about this novel.
Well, why don't you just explain, Teresa, for people listening in the future, what's going on this week?
For people listening in the future, Jeff Bezos went to space this week.
And right? Richard Branson.
And Richard Branson, and isn't Elon Musk going sometime soon? I mean, it's a thing for the billionaires to be like the Tessier Ashpools and go up into space because it's there. But then I feel like this is like a kind of a result of it. Once they own it, they don't want it. They seal themselves, like they crawled off the dump of a planet Earth to seal themselves up into a luxury resort on space that has really become a tomb for this dynasty of generational wealth that keeps getting passed down. And it's, it's hard not to imagine that being kind of an unintentional endgame of the Bezoses and Musks. Like we see this again and again in science fiction, books, film, everything. That's what they do. They isolate themselves from everybody else, from the have-nots, to try to keep themselves safe and become this horrible inbred MC Escher-esque mega corporation that are so big you don't even know how many other companies they own throughout the world. It's like we continually talk nowadays about, oh, I'm going to boycott like this company, like this week it was like Frito-Lay. I'm going to boycott Fritos because, they don't treat their workers right. Well, okay, you could do that, but then they're owned by PepsiCo, which also owns literally like 100 other different companies. So you'd still be supporting. And that was one of the things I loved about how they slowly bring the Tessier Ashpools into the story. Case doesn't even think about them until he hears the name for the first time. Then he's riding the subway and he sees that ad for Freeside, and he really looks at the logo on it for the first time. I was like, oh shit, I've walked past this 100 times and never thought about it.
Mm-hmm. So Matt, do you want to say any? So you said like you were surprised how much of this takes place in space. Like, what did you think about the way that the outer space stuff was depicted in the book?
Well, just jumping off what Teresa said, I didn't necessarily get the horrific vibe, and I think that might be because the last 4 years were so horrific to me. I think I've been kind of desensitized a little bit from some of the stuff, but I think that Gibson was definitely playing a little coy with some of like how all this stuff works. I think there's one reference to like the center line light that goes through the middle of the cylinder. I think they were talking about an O'Neill cylinder or something. Are you asking me like about the technology of it or?
Yeah, well, because I felt like there was a lot of detail about the like it seems like every clamp and gasket and thing is described exactly what material it's made out of, and like. Well,
that's just Gibson in general.
Yeah.
I think that he'd like.
What country did all the gaskets?
Someone can't walk into a room without him describing like the make of their shoes and like what kind of tie they're wearing and where they got their jacket
on their jeans.
Yeah. Like there was, I forgot which novel it was. I think it was
from Fez.
It was the one after Pattern Recognition. It might have been Spook Country, where there was like this hitman, this killer, and he checks into a hotel room, and then he's like remarking on like the type of metal that they used on the faucets in the bathroom. and I was like, well, maybe this like, he's a sensitive killer. That's cool. But it just seemed like Gibson loves to just describe every little detail of
the part that I think this is right. Like when they meet Ashpool and he's just like murdered his like clone daughter and she's like lying across the bed in a pool of blood, and it's like he sat down on the leather chair with squared off chrome feet,
Right. Yeah.
Maybe I read too much into some of that stuff because I'm like, oh well, he's just. Gibson definitely has his quirks. He loves his wristwatches and bomber jackets from various armies around the world. But, in a way, like, it made me think about how connected all these economies are to one another and gave me a little hint about that. But in the beginning of Neuromancer, when I hadn't read him for a while, I was like, okay, Italian leather shoes with, in a mid-century Swiss chair with sourced from Fez. Like, I don't know. I was just like, okay.
I wonder if he's just trying to like draw our attention to how like materialistic the society has become. Like everybody's just so like brainwashed by capitalism that the first thing they see is the material that someone is wearing, not the person.
To me, it's like this is a facet of his genius as a writer, is to root you in the real and the detailed and atmosphere and smell and sight and yes, manufacture point and provenance. That as he's describing these incredibly bizarre, weird, technologically futuristic worlds, he's making it feel really grounded and lived in and scuffed up and dirty. And aged. So yeah, I think that's part, like, it's the essence of his prose. It's at the heart of his sort of like world building, is to make the bizarre feel not banal, but like hauntingly familiar.
And I felt like just having the Rastafarians in space for 1983, like I don't know how much stuff like that had been done previously in science fiction, but I felt like, that was kind of, I felt like maybe that was sort of a novel sort of depiction of the future for that time.
This is my one. Okay, so I probably said this more than once. Like, this is my one problem. I've had like 5 problems, but like sort of my overall, like, I love that one of the things that I love about William Gibson is how interconnected his worlds feel, as we've said before, that there's like, the real politic of Russia and Japan and China and Germany and the United States, and also, wealth and poverty. That's throughout his books. They're always really diverse. There's always like lots of people from lots of different backgrounds. It's about the obscenely wealthy and like the gutter trash and how they stand equal before the eyes of God and the reader. But the one thing that's always missing is queerness. Like, there might be a little bit of it here and there. There's usually like, there's one, I think it might even be pattern recognition, right? Where she thinks that this one guy is gay through the whole book and they're best friends. And then in the end, she finds out he's not, and then they hook up. It's something that like, there's queerness in very small, very spare brushstrokes. That's the only part of his worlds that I wish were different.
But it was like it was funny, like what people are talking about with how influential Neuromancer is, because, like all the stuff with Zion and everything, having seen The Matrix before having read Neuromancer. And I thought I basically knew what happened in Neuromancer, but actually reading it, I was like, oh my God, I didn't realize just how much of The Matrix, just how much of Ghost in the Shell.
Keanu Reeves, man, Johnny Mnemonic, The Matrix. Yep. It's all Keanu Reeves.
2077.
Like, the hub of the
Trinity in The Matrix is basically Molly Millions.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I know, David, you're a big fan of The Expanse, and I feel like there was like, I was reading through, I can't remember exactly what it was, but I was like, oh, The Expanse totally took some stuff from this as well. Or influenced by it.
Yeah, I mean that I used to, again, as someone who really loves Virtual Light and the Bridge trilogy, that Jessica Alba show, Dark Angel, absolutely ripped off Virtual Light, the Bike Messengers.
Oh, Julie Mao from The Expanse reminds me of Molly Millions. But we were talking about like also stuff that Gibson anticipated, and I was thinking like, drones, like today it's like everywhere, but in '84 I don't think that was really a popular thing. Misinformation, cyber terrorism, and this story actually has aliens in it. Like there's this like reference at the end where the AI that the Wintermute Neuromancer merger basically encounters an AI from Alpha Centauri, which I was like, oh, I completely forgot that as well. I'm like, that's kind of cool. Like I almost want to read that story.
And the space Rastas were kind of interesting. I definitely forgot about them.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I'd like to hear like Tobias Buckell maybe speak on it better. I think of him in particular as a Caribbean SF writer who writes about Caribbean characters on reimagined future islands and diaspora in space. So I was like, I like that they were there to kind of round out a picture of just here's not just people from, like Russia, China, America, like these hegemonies, like space can be for everyone, which I kind of liked, but it also just seemed like, well, here's some just zany window dressing we're going to kind of throw up in there without any other commentary really, other than to do something cool. Like, here's some cool shit, cool hand wavy shit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I liked that they were there. I mean, they felt very one-dimensional, but like so many of the characters felt one-dimensional that, I mean, I think that's an issue that goes through the book. But yeah, like if you want, you should definitely read Tobias Buckell's Xenowealth series if you want Caribbean characters in space that are, a lot better developed than you see in Neuromancer. But what Matt was saying about, but I think the real, because Gibson gets a lot of the details wrong, right? Like, obviously, like hacking a computer system doesn't involve riding a flying giant shark,
It doesn't?
You're doing it wrong, David.
What have I been doing all my life?
Only in the 90s.
And Gibson, in his foreword, he mentions, like the payphones and the modems and the mechanical printers and like the stuff that hasn't aged well. But like, I think that what the real strength of this book is, and Jack Womack talks about this in his afterword, at least that's in the edition that I read, is that like more than any other science fiction book that I can think of, Neuromancer feels like it conveys what the future is going to feel like. Like you read this book and you're like, it feels like it was written in 1999. And you're like, oh wait, no, this was written in 1983. Like,
yeah,
it just so captures that feel, even if a lot of the, the technical details are off or whatever.
It almost feels like there was something in the air, right? Because so if you saw Blade Runner and then you saw, you read Neuromancer, you'd be like, oh, one copied the other, right? But actually, like Gibson said that he went into the theater, he saw 20 minutes of Blade Runner, he's like, oh shit, they're gonna think I ripped this off. And I don't think that Ridley Scott actually ripped off Neuromancer either. And then, you look at something like the movie Tron, right, which has that kind of immersive virtual reality world, and it was almost like there was something in the air in the early 80s, like this. It's where the like you said, David, earlier, like the techno utopianism went smack dab against like the excess capitalism of the 80s, and then they're like, well, what's going to happen with this future? And it took a few geniuses to really map that out. And I think Gibson was one of them. And he really, he didn't get everything right, but he got a lot of it right. And, it's really amazing just to go through it now, like you said, and say, oh, this was written in 83. My God.
Well, we were talking about this in an earlier episode, but like, there's no computer stuff really in Blade Runner, right? There's no internet, there's no hacking, like Neuromancer, that is where this is going, that separates it from something like Blade Runner. I know that you love Blade Runner so much that.
Well, I think it's in the background of Blade Runner. You have like video phones and things like that, but yes, it's not like, you have his like, basically early Photoshop machine that scans the photos and things like that. So it's there, it's in the background, but it's not the focus of it, like it is in Neuromancer. But even in Neuromancer, it's like almost like the hacking. It's not the way it's depicted today, where like someone's like, it's Unix, I know this, and they go three sentences on a keyboard, and they're into like the NSA, it's more of just like he says, like this consensual hallucination, and what he calls ICE, the intrusion countermeasures electronics, is like it's an analog for like active firewalls that we have today, content delivery networks that adapt to changing threats. So it's a metaphor for it, and I think he was kind of smart to do it that way, because it's like you could just say, yeah, well that's what it is. It's a consensual hallucination. It's a metaphor for what's going on on the lower layers of the system. That's actually how the internet works. It's just abstractions upon abstractions upon abstractions. Like, it starts with the electricity on the wire, and then you just keep going up layers upon layers, and then eventually, you get YouTube. So it's like, I don't think he was like wrong, quote unquote, by doing it that way.
I mean, it's kind of a BS game trying to spot where a science fiction writer got it wrong. Like, it's all wrong. It's all always wrong. Like, 2001, no matter how hard the science fiction is, no matter how, how much we love it, it's all coming out of a moment in time that is,
Right.
Whatever. It's like, even the idea of recreation in space is a product of a time when the space race felt like it was going to continue forever, and that we would see expansion in space of we're going to have living quarters and buildings and cities, and there is a future in space, which isn't really the case now in the sort of post-Soviet era, where it's companies using space to profit off of and for telecommunications, and that it has military and capitalist functions, but it's not a place where tons of people live and hang out, and it's not the future we have.
Yeah, like in the book they talk about, oh, I was either going to go to Europe or I was going to go to Freeside. That's not.
Yeah.
And it's 2033, I believe. Neuromancer.
Yeah, well, I mean, but do you agree with me, Sam, that 'cause you read Philip K. Dick or something, and it's set in the year 2300, but you're this is the 1950s, and pretty much all science fiction, you read it and you can tell exactly when it was written. But I feel like Neuromancer, like I said, it feels like it was written in the late 90s, not the early 80s, and I feel like there's something really special about that.
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's a part of that comes down to his prose and the way and how even the weirdest of word choices, we talked earlier about the sort of slang in it. To me, it doesn't feel like slang. It feels like a really particular use of language where even the most bizarre word choices make a kind of sense after you think about them. I don't remember if it's in Neuromancer or where, but he was the first person to ever talk about how when a car went by, the sound Dopplered past, and how you can just immediately I've seen this used elsewhere since, just that that effortlessly communicates that sensation of the way the pitch changes on sound as it moves in relation to your ears. So yeah, it feels so stark and vivid to me. It's part of why he makes me so angry, jealous, because that's something that I would love to be able to do, and that he does, and in a way that makes his prose feel really always of the moment.
But then also just in relation to what Matt was saying, I mean that I feel like one thing that this book kind of gets wrong, quote unquote, that pretty much all science fiction gets wrong is not able to see just how ubiquitous and commonplace technological advances are going to be, right? This book still presents the internet as something that only super special, super cool people will be able to access, and not take it that step further to be oh wait, no, even just average, the most average person will all be on this, and it's that's a really hard leap, I think, of speculation to make, is there's something that seems so amazing to us and realize no, wait, everyone's going to have this,
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly I didn't read through this and say, oh, well, he got that wrong. That's not how I read fiction, even of its time. It's more of, am I effectively conveyed through this world that he's created? Is it a complete world? And it absolutely is. And I think what I meant with the hacking stuff is just that I think the metaphor works. I think he was vague enough to describe in the way he described it that I was I'm going to roll with this in this world. I think it absolutely works for what he created. Does it have any basis in reality? Probably not. But it for what it did, it worked.
Yeah, and I mean, for me as someone who doesn't read a lot of science fiction, I mean, I read some, but definitely not as much as other panelists. I find Neuromancer to be extremely accessible to anybody, because it is like a classic Raymond Chandler story with these immersive things. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to know about the Gernsback continuum and the golden age of science fiction. I mean, granted, coming at it now, you're going to know about the Matrix and cyberspace and cyberpunk and all that stuff, but you really can go into this and just get pulled along into the story. And that's a testament to his prose. I mean, everyone talks about Molly's mirror eyes. Gibson himself, I just read like this long like listserv post from like the early 90s where he's like, oh, I have no idea if they're like under her eyelids or implanted like on her skin like sunglasses outside of her eyes. He's like, I don't know, because if I try to think about how much that works, you know, or how that would work and affect her tears, it doesn't matter. It's just something, again, like a metaphor that partitions her off from her private self.
There was a line that said that her tear ducts are rerouted through her salivary glands, which I thought was a cool detail.
Yeah.
I actually just had a couple other, like, just in terms of conveying a world through just random details, I just had two examples I wanted to mention. So there's a line where Case says, "What's that smell?" And Molly says, "The grass smells that way after they cut it." And he's like, never smelled mown grass before. I thought that was
yeah,
great.
That's pretty amazing.
And then there's a part where the Finn says, "It's a horse, man. You ever seen a horse?" And Case says, "Saw one in Maryland once."
Yeah.
It just conveys how that horses are basically extinct. Yeah.
He said, I was reading something the other day where he likes the idea of conveying like a huge amount through like one sentence, and I think he was inspired by Escape from New York when God help me with the character's name.
Snake Plissken.
Snake Plissken. Thank you. Snake Plissken. Thank you. Where Snake Plissken, like when they're like hiring him for the job, they're like, "You did that Russian thing, right?" And then it was like Gibson was like, just imagine this entire other thing that happened in the background. It was just conveyed with one line. And I think like those two examples you gave, Dave, like do that extremely well. And he does that continually throughout. So it's like, it's this incredible, like painting of what's going on in the background that just fills my head. And like, sometimes I find myself just while I was reading, I was just imagining you know, all these other things happening in the world that's not going on in the moment because he's just so good at it.
Yeah, he also, in that same Guardian article talking about first lines, he talked about exactly that, except, you know, like a little throwaway line to reveal a bit about a character in relation to Get Shorty. You know, it's like the opening sentences of Get Shorty, and like, yeah, and then this guy walked in, and, you know, I hadn't seen him since that night that so-and-so got his coat stolen at the bar in Reno or whatever. And it just paints this picture of a night, an event more. And that's, again, I think you get that a lot more with Molly than with other people. But then maybe on the flip side, from a much darker side, one of my favorite characters in the book was Riviera, because he was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
He was awful, you know, like, but fascinating to watch. And I think a lot of horror comes from there for me. Like, before you even meet this guy, Molly's like, I read his profile. He's fucked. Like, he is a fucked up bad person. And then you meet him and that's when things get really disorienting. Like, when he first appeared, I was like, what? Why are there fish swimming around now? And then I'm like, oh, now I get what he could do. Ooh. No.
This is also one of my favorite plot moments of like the sort of like magician's wonder that William Gibson does, of like suddenly like, ta-da, here's something bizarre and incredible in the end when there's the fight with the vat-grown clone ninja, and he's like, who's been bigged up as this like stone cold, unkillable, badass, unstoppable, and Riviera manages to blind him by shooting him in the eyes with lasers, and you're like, oh shit, Riviera got the guy who can't be got. But then it's like, no, he's like, how will you blind? The ninja says, what? How will you like trick me with your illusions now? And then gets him really effortlessly. So it's just like this great moment of like badass characters who've been well drawn, put up against each other in ways that are like astonishing and fun and surprising and like make you go ooh in a sort of like movie blockbuster kind of way.
Exactly. And it's like, you know, again, these tropes, the console cowboy, the street samurai, you know, the blind samurai is totally a trope.
Yeah. And
love it.
And so Riviera, he can create hologram illusions. I just want to explain that if anyone is a little confused about that.
And he is also a sociopath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone had the Jack Womack afterword in their edition of Neuromancer, but
I did.
oh yeah, I know
Not
Teresa.
me.
I know Teresa did.
Yeah, I did too.
Okay, cool. But so
Yeah, I got rid of the copy that my ex-boyfriend gave me a long time ago. I upgraded to the 20th anniversary edition.
But so let me just read. So Jack Womack says, oh wait, sorry. Let me read first. In the intro, Gibson says that he was fueled by, quote, a smoldering resentment at what the genre I'd loved as a teenager seemed to me in the meantime to have become. And then Jack Womack says, not since the days of the new wave in the 60s had there been such consternation over and misinterpretation of a book and its significance among those who should know better but somehow never do. And I wish they were a little bit more specific about what the issues were on both sides. But does anyone have any picked up any information that sheds any light on why Gibson was disillusioned with science fiction?
What was he mad at? What book did he hate?
Dune. No.
Well, I mean, wasn't the Gernsback continuum that's the story, was his disillusionment with kind of the techno-utopian visions of the golden age?
Yes.
And so I think maybe he showed so clearly in Neuromancer that he saw that runaway capitalism was not going to bring us to this utopia and was alienating us, and that's why he wrote these stories. Maybe he didn't see the future, because you said that he was his history before he was a writer was doing lots of drugs and couch surfing and trying to avoid the draft, and maybe he saw aspects of, I'm hypothesizing, but maybe he saw aspects of human society that capitalism wasn't helping and in fact hurting, and maybe he was like, well, I'm gonna write about the underculture that maybe these utopian science fiction authors of the 60s and 70s weren't really addressing.
Yeah, plus, coming up in the 80s, he is a fan of punk rock, and that's kind of anti-everything. You could see it in, I think Screaming Fist, which was, again, these names that he comes up with are incredible, like Villa Straylight and Screaming Fist and Dixie Flatline. He's so good with just listening to words. That Screaming Fist was a punk song from this Canadian punk band. So he threw that in there. I think, there might be something to it, again, growing up in a post-World War II era in America and seeing the after effects of that Russia, China, Japan would outpace us militarily, technologically. And there's this line of anxiety and exoticism for all of that, with the punk and cyberpunk kind of under there being well, you guys are all focused on dirigibles and shiny robots and shit like that. Well, I've got people getting their pancreas nuked from space to, not be able to access the internet anymore. I'm going to sit down and tell you a William S. Burroughs, a Naked Lunch kind of science fiction, because that wasn't very popular at the time. That wasn't what was filling these dime store science fiction novels. It wasn't William S. Burroughs science fiction.
The only thing I wonder about with that is that Gibson, he says he loved science fiction growing up, and then it had become something he didn't like in the meantime. And I feel like all the techno-optimism stuff goes back to the 40s, 50s. So I wonder if there is, I'm just curious if there's something more specific he's talking about that happened in the 70s, I guess, late 70s that he was really bothered by, or?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of the older science fiction books I think I've read.
I wish he was on Fantastic Fiction again, because then we could ask him that question.
I was actually curious, Matt, because you know Ellen Datlow really well, and my understanding is she was really instrumental in Gibson's early career, publishing those short stories.
Yeah,
in Omni
yeah,
magazine.
I believe she was his editor at Omni. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to ask her more about it. She did tell me about it a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. My former coworker, David Hartwell, he had worked with Gibson a lot in the 80s, and they knew each other very well. And I remember like being abandoned on a sofa by David as I'm sitting between William Gibson and Jack Womack at an author event, and just being like, I am just going to be quiet and listen to these two gentlemen talk about Kentucky over my head.
William Gibson is maybe the only science fiction writer I've ever been too starstruck to talk to at a Nebula Awards. Of like, I think I said hi. My husband forced me to, like, shoved me at him, but the conversation was minimal and immediately forgotten by both parties.
Well, I admit, like, personal side note, again, Neuromancer was introduced to me by an ex. Did not see him for a number of years, but then, I've become a big William Gibson fan, so much so that there is a group of New York area fans who I've met through Twitter, and we all go to like the front row of his event, and we'll sit and chat with him afterwards a little bit. And I just remember being at like a Union Square event for pattern recognition and being up there talking to Bill and looking out in the audience, and then just seeing that ex-boyfriend for the first time. And I'm just like, like through the hair flip, I'm like, yes, I'm going to stay up here and just keep talking for a few more, even if I might be an idiot. Just like, that's it. You dumped me. I took your author.
Was that at Barnes and Noble?
Yeah, Barnes and Noble.
Oh, I was there. He signed my copy of Pattern Recognition. I don't think I knew you then.
No,
or maybe we were acquainted.
Maybe not. I was hanging out with one of the people from the Gibson Twitter collective, Rupa, my friend Rupa.
Oh, do you remember that
I want to be part of that group.
Do you remember
when he comes to town, Sam?
Right.
Awesome.
Do you remember when someone got up and criticized Gibson's use of the word rumination?
No, I think I probably blocked that out. Anytime someone says I have more of a statement than a question, I immediately cringe into a black hole.
No, actually, I'm misremembering. What he said was, oh, you should have used the word rumination. And then Gibson says, when I think of rumination, I think of sheep. And then he like goes to the next question. It was such a great response. It was.
He is delightful at readings. When he goes on tour, which, he seems to have books out pretty regularly. Props to him for writing so regularly.
Yeah.
His author events are always really fun to attend. He's great conversationalist.
I actually think I was at that event too, but
we were all there.
We were all there.
Wow.
Sam was there and
F me and F my life.
You were in like the cafe and you were like nearby.
It's totally possible.
Because I think pattern recognition started with a beautiful he read a beautiful description of being above Union Square, like a Union Square hotel.
Yes. Wow.
That stuck with me, and I'm like, your audience,
Well, I guess like that was like one of the, maybe the final thing I'll bring up here is that William Gibson did become this like celebrity in a way that, I mean, Jack Womack says, in every generation, there's room enough in the American popular mind to admit only one science fiction writer. It was Bradbury for a while, and then Asimov, and then he says, and then, quote, that guy who writes Star Trek /Wars. But I guess I'm curious to get your opinion on this, all of you. Is William Gibson like the last science fiction writer to become a household name? Has anyone become reached that level?
Emphatically, no.
No, you think not?
N.K. Jemisin is almost there.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah,
Childish Gambino lyric is is as close as you can get, I think, to iconic household name status.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I didn't hear about the about the lyric. But yeah, so but you think that if when I was in my MFA program, for example, the people who didn't read any science fiction, they'd be like, oh yeah, I like Asimov, I like Gibson. Like those are like the only science fiction writers they knew, and I wonder if today I guess maybe they would know N.K. Jemisin. That'd be cool.
I think they would know N.K. I would like to think maybe they would know John Scalzi.
Scalzi's big. I mean, N.K. Jemisin has her master class, and like I didn't even know about it. Like I'm scrolling through Facebook, it's like master class by N.K. Jemisin. I'm like, oh my god, this is amazing.
So does everybody because I see that a million times a day, but I thought maybe that was just the algorithm knows that I like science fiction. But do lots of other does everyone see those things all the time?
I mean, I feel I get the Neil Gaiman one a lot for whatever reason, but yeah, my boxing trainer is in like the master class with N.K. Jemisin, so because he also writes. So I mean, I'd say that's a pretty huge level of popularity. I think with William Gibson, and again, it might be because of my age, because, coming up in the 90s in like the goth industrial scene, we did kind of play with a lot of the imagery of cyberpunk. I mean, there were cyberpunks, but then there were cyber goths, which were the pictures I have of that era are very embarrassing, with lots of neon hair and plastic and goggles.
Man. Need to share them now.
All that stuff. I mean, it was like the Matrix before the Matrix came out, and then when the Matrix came out, then it got even more popular and more ultra. But it's funny. So William Gibson was definitely had a big kind of cult of personality there, which I think he would really laugh at, because he is not. You're never going to find William Gibson in a goth club. Like even when he was at his youngest, doubtful he would be at a place like that. And but he does talk about, very specific kinds of like military style, like this fetishization of weird objects like wristwatches and again, bomber jackets and certain kinds of jeans and material, and furniture. Like he's a design nerd. And I think that kind of makes him a bit of a cipher and mysterious. So it's like he's cool and he kind of invented the Matrix, but he's low key about it. He likes this stuff, this kind of stuff. And I think that gives him a mystique and an enduring appeal, But then when you group him in with other writers of the time who were writing, a lot of them were writing cyberpunk, and then some of them were writing splatterpunk too. Like I'm thinking of John Shirley in particular. Then you've got Louis Shiner, some really interesting ones. Looking at George Alec Effinger, When Gravity Fails, another really great, Middle Eastern infused kind of cyberpunk series. People just keep bringing Gibson up again, he's kind of like a gold standard for that kind of movement at the time. But, I think time goes on, his novels have drastically changed in focus and scope. So he's still doing his thing and just being authentic to his voice and his interests,
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because I haven't read any of his later novels, but my understanding is that they get closer and closer to the present.
Yes.
And sort of what does that say when even William Gibson is like, just writing about the near future is hard enough, let alone 100 years from now? What hope is there for the rest of us?
Well, the current trilogy, of which there are 2 books written, published, The Peripheral and Agency, is set in parallel timelines, one of which is very close to our own.
Potential spoiler. But
No, this is all in the flap copy.
Okay.
And the other of which is at least 100 years in the future, if not significantly more than that, and is sort of imagining a pretty wild vision of the future of humanity after the collapse that we're currently bringing upon ourselves. So I think he's finding things to be excited about the future. I'm not sure they're entirely successful books, but
I like The Peripheral more than other people did. I think I haven't read Agency. I've had copy sitting here for ages and have not gotten to it yet. I do, but I've read the Bridge trilogy like 3 times. Full disclosure, I've never read Count Zero or Mona Lisa Overdrive. You know, I love Neuromancer, but I just didn't feel like I wanted to quite go back to that world because it felt a little too, when I first read it, it felt a little too heady for me. So I went to Virtual Light instead because it's the start of a new trilogy and was just absolutely absorbed into it. I loved like the big eyeball kick set piece at the center of it, which is a bunch of squatters living on the Oakland Bay Bridge. It was gorgeous.
So good.
The way it was described, like Skinner's room, like, you know, when I went to San Francisco for the first time and I read Virtual Light before I went, and, you know, just think of the bike messengers and Barry and Gunhead and like the whole thing, like the North-South California divide. And then you get the second book, which again has some crossover with Neuromancer. I love the SimStim stars that they always mention. He's been writing about them since Burning Chrome. You know, these pop stars who like the first.
They're like YouTubers, basically.
Yeah, YouTubers, you know, but you're really watching things through their eyes. It's horrifying. You know, I love that just felt more prescient. And also David Bowie makes a cameo in Adoru, which is
so
amazing.
brilliantly done. So
right?
brilliantly done.
Right? I think of that like every time I'm on an airplane and I'm like, why can't I upload a program where I'm biking through Venice with David Bowie playing new music? That's the future I want.
So wait, so what William Gibson novel should I read next, keeping in mind that I am more interested in the more science fictional, more into the future kind of thing?
I mean, I would say that, you know, objectively, most likely Pattern Recognition is probably his best novel since Neuromancer. I think it just really landed with a lot of people. But again, you know, it's not like far future wild tech. The September 11th attacks are really like the jumping off point for that. But I think he does a great job.
Yeah.
I personally...
Go ahead.
I just personally love Virtual Light and Adoru.
I would second. I think the Bridge trilogy is the sweetest spot. Even though Pattern Recognition is my favorite, I also think it's his least science fictional. And I think the Bridge trilogy is the perfect sweet spot of when he's in possession of all of his powers at the most and bringing them to bear upon like a future that is like vivid and palpable and weird and wild and full of eyeball kicks and people you really love and care about.
Oh, I feel so vindicated. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, and he's like, I think Gibson in some sense is an anthropologist, and I think it's very clear in the Bridge trilogy, just like these focus on these different cultures and like subcultures, and I mean,
the street definitely finds its own uses for things.
Yeah,
love it.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. So do people have any, how about Matt, any final thoughts on this whole experience of rereading Neuromancer?
All this talk of the Bridge trilogy books makes me want to reread them. I haven't read them in a while. So yeah, William Gibson, he's definitely one of my favorite science fiction writers. And it's always awesome talking about him and his work. Neuromancer is great. You know, I think it was the first Gibson book I ever read, and it was awesome revisiting it. And you know, I hadn't really thought about rereading Gibson's other books in a while, and now I think after this, I'm probably going to at some point go back into the Bridge trilogy and the others.
All right, cool. Sam, final thoughts on Neuromancer?
I love it. I love every weird moment of it. This has been super fun because y'all have said a lot of things that made me like think really interestingly and differently about it, even though it's something that I've read many times and thought about a lot. I'm going to have to look. I feel the William S. Burroughs vibe now that Teresa mentioned that, so I'm going to have to like dig into that. So yeah, thanks for giving me a chance to geek out about this book I love.
Yeah, and like I said, I ended up liking this more than I thought I was going to, and the first 6 chapters I think are absolutely unmissable. Like I would definitely say that everyone should read those, and then, you know, if you like them, definitely, you know, keep reading. But don't miss the first 6 chapters for sure. And so Teresa, final thoughts?
Yeah, I was really happy to have this conversation too, because it's been such a long time. I continually go back to, a few of William Gibson's short stories, and I recommend, yes, read Neuromancer for sure. And if you like it, definitely go back and read Burning Chrome, because he's never written short stories since. It's amazing, and it's sad, and it's frustrating, but that's just not his thing anymore. But he's written one of the most iconic first lines in a science fiction novel. But one of my favorite last lines is in Burning Chrome, and I see her on the edge of all this ice and city, and sometimes she waves goodbye. Like, he just punches you in the gut with his prose. Like, it's beautiful. So I just hope more people get a chance to appreciate him just on a sentence level. He will always pull you along.
All right, great. Yeah, I'll have to go back and reread Burning Chrome now, because, yeah, that does sound really great. But so we are all out of time, so we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Matthew Kressel, Teresa Delucci, and Sam J. Miller. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yay.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Matthew Kressel, Teresa Delucci, and Sam J. Miller for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.